So, speaking of dry areas, speaking of Southern California, and just kind of the mismanagement, but also there's another conversation to the overall state of affairs of this area. So, this article, this is from the Free Press. And someone wrote this article, says, "Stop blaming politicians. LA was built to burn." And it says, "Blame whoever you want, but the reality is we have built a massive civilization where fire is part of the natural habitat." So the reason I bring attention to this, not only because it's written by a guy named Leighton Woodhouse, which sounds like the most smug name I could ever imagine. Like, that sounds like a comic book stooge, like aristocrat, like someone with the, big giant mansion. "Oh, Master Leighton Woodhouse is in the study right now. You can meet with him in the foyer as you eat this caviar from the rare sea bass that's currently extinct. It's black labeled." Like, it just seems like such a predominant stooge name, Leighton Woodhouse. But regardless of that, the other reason I want to show this article is because this is the other conversation I think now people are addressing. And the other conversation is not only the mismanagement, not only just the political side of things and just the what city officials have done to California, but also just California as a state. And unfortunately, in the regards of things like climate change and whatever side you're on, like the reason climate change, I feel is such a debacle at this point is because people, I think, are realizing the bigger perspective that you can't legislate nature. There's no real way to legislate the control of nature. Nature is going to happen. It's going to do its thing. And the only thing we can do as human beings, if we want to maintain survival, is look at ways to maybe look at precautionary measures, or we're just going to have to deal with it. And we got to start asking these questions. If California continues to go into blaze every so often, are we going to be able to live there? Are people going to be able to sustain a life and a household and a family in a place that is prone to many, many disasters? That's what this guy, I think, is saying here, but we'll get into the article. It says, "There's a common misconception that beneath the asphalt, Los Angeles is a desert. It isn't. It's a grassland, and part of the natural cycle of the grassland ecosystem is fire." 27 years ago, Mike Davis wrote Ecology of Fear, Los Angeles and the Imagination of Disaster. One of the chapters is titled The Case for Letting Malibu Burn. In it, he argued that the area between the beach and the Santa Monica Mountains simply never should have been developed. No matter what measures we take to prevent it, those hills are going to burn, and the houses we erected upon them are only so much kindling. California's binary wet-dry seasonal cycle means rain in the winter, which feeds the growth of chaparral and sage in the hills, and coastal mountains, followed by dry summer heat, which turns that biomass into fuel for wildfires. In Los Angeles, add that to the mix of warm San Diego winds, which sweep into the basin of the San Fernando Valley and are channeled into the canyons of the Santa Monica Mountains, reaching hurricane-level velocities in the process. Then add human settlement and all the millions of opportunities it presents to produce a spark, the likelihood of a disaster like what is happening, in Davis's words, a statistical certainty. Pointing to urban development as the culprit at a time like this is a lot like blaming the victim, but it's more honest than the many other culprits being trotted out on social media, like DEI, Gavin Newsom, or Donald Trump. Certainly, there is blame to go around. Mayor Karen Bass shouldn't have been in Ghana. We need to know why the fire hydrants went dry. climate change exacerbates the natural conditions that produce the wildfires in the first place. But the fundamental engine for these disasters is the simple physical reality of California, which prevailed before any of us were born. We built a massive civilization in a place where fire is as much a part of the natural habitat as summer rains are in the East. Anyone who has lived in LA for more than a year has experienced either a season of active wildfires or a season of worrying about whether they could come. Joan Didion has written about it. The area around Pacific Palisades, in particular, has been on fire countless times before. There was a huge conflagration in Malibu in 1929, then in 1930, and 1935, then in 1938, and 1943, and so on and so on, averaging 2 per decade up to the current day. There's a reason this happens so much in Los Angeles. It is unique among American cities for the degree to which it directly abuses wild nature. Older cities grew more gradually. Around the urban core of cities like Boston, Atlanta, or St. Louis emerged suburbs. Around them, exurbs. And around them, rural agricultural zones. Only then do you reach wild forests, mountains, or prairies. Los Angeles grew up in a hurry. In the 19th and 20th centuries, development occurred so rapidly that urban suburban densities extended unbatted all the way up until it collides into the wildlands. A long portion of the city's perimeter is fenced in by the Santa Monica and San Gabriel Mountains. Dense residential neighborhoods and freeways sit directly beneath towering bluffs populated by mountain lions, which occasionally hop the fences of backyard swimming pools to feast on domestic cats and dogs. Where New York has its meticulously designed Central Park, Los Angeles has Griffith Park, a sprawling expanse of wild mountain terrain right in the middle of the city. These abrupt borders between nature and city are called wildland-urban interfaces, and they're inherently volatile. Man-made sparks from homeless encampments, discarded cigarettes, and downed power lines easily ignite wildfires, while brush fires that start from natural causes, like lightning, easily make up the leap into residential areas and become urban conflagrations. The pattern of residential development that has yielded these interfaces isn't limited to Southern California. In 2018, the Camp Fire in Northern California's rural Butte County started as a human-ignited forest fire, but ended up killing dozens and displacing thousands because towns like Paradise were carved out of the landscape and were edged up directly against the forests. People should be held accountable for the mistakes that they made in forest management, climate emissions, or reckless behavior with flammable objects, but the hazards of California's built environment are no one's fault, or at least no one who is still alive. Many of the state's wildland-urban interfaces are the result of residential developments that began in the 19th century or the first half of the 20th century. This is the tinderbox we inherited. This will not be the last time we watch it burn. So, this is kind of the greater story to the state of California, that it's its own conversation of this. Because I know primarily we focus on city officials, the state government, and their proportions and the response to how they amplified the lack of response to this. But it goes into a deeper philosophical question in an article like this. Is California, if you know that there's going to be these natural disasters occurring constantly, is there a point or a moment that we have to look at California as a state and realize that we can't have sustainable living conditions in this kind of area, that we can't develop between high mountain areas that we know are flammable, that we know that there's going to be active wildfires engaging and going through this constant cycle day after day after day. It's a harder conversation of this. Like I said, that's why climate change, for example, regardless of what you feel in that regard, what you feel about climate change as a whole, it's such a hard conversation. It's such a harder thing to process because it's not a simple issue. Because it's not as simple as shutting off shutting off the light, or changing your car to an electric, or getting rid of the gas powered lawnmowers. It's such a harder conversation because, as we heard earlier, nature is going to nature. Nature's going to do its thing. It's going to do whatever it can to remain in effect. It's going to cause disasters. It's going to have these hurricanes or tornadoes or earthquakes or whatever the case may be. And you got to ask yourself, at what point are we going to figure out that you can't legislate against nature? That at some point it's just going to happen and we have to deal with it. And if we have to deal with it so many times, maybe it's about time we looked into the infrastructure and look into ourselves and look into communities and realize that maybe it's not a good idea to have residential areas. Maybe it's not sustainable to have developments, to have communities, to have residential suburbs in places that are common to this. And it kind of goes into an example of when I was a teenager, I used to watch a lot of storm chaser activity because I was kind of really big into that. I don't know why. I don't know exactly why that time in my life, but I guess it was popular because they had like Discovery Channel shows at the time. But I used to watch these storm chaser videos. And maybe because I wanted to get into it. Maybe that was it. Maybe I thought for a brief second that maybe it'd be cool to, video camera and take pictures of tornadoes coming by and be riding around in that, what do they call it? The Doominator, the asphalt covered SUV that they have, until you realize that it's actually very dangerous, and that kind of what drove me away to it. But every time I saw something like that, every time I saw natural disasters, I always had this kind of feeling that when you're going through places like Tornado Alley, when you're going through a lot of the Midwest, and you hear about the stories of people that have been having to rebuild and rebuild and rebuild their towns and communities significantly because the mass amount of tornadoes and active weather that they have, at what point do people look at that and maybe take this philosophical moment to say that you can't sustain yourself in that kind of environment? And I get that, it's beautiful. A lot of the areas you go to and move to in California, for example, a lot of these homes are on hillsides and you get to see the overview of the entire city. It's beautiful. But at what point do we look at that and have this kind of inner moment to understand, is this feasible? Is it feasible to have a hillside mountaintop mansion in an area that is prone to fires, in an area that's prone to mudslides, in an area that's prone to earthquakes, in an area that's prone to tsunamis, which I know in the mountain area that you don't have to worry about that, but add to that list. So Kim Iverson also has this kind of philosophical moment. She's another California commentator. Feel free to check out her show. Does a lot of great work. She says there's a lot of blame. There's a lot of blame that could be placed on the California government, but there's equal, if not more blame, to place on the homeowners. She says they knew without a shadow of doubt that they were buying in extremely fire-prone hills. They ignored it for the views, the beautiful property, and the prestige. I bought a home in LA 2.5 years ago. I love the hills and the canyons, but did not buy very, very, very specifically because of the fire danger. That was the only thing holding me back from a great house tucked away somewhere in the Santa Monica Mountains. Here's a snapshot of wildfires over the past 150 years. We'll get into that after this. This isn't just a government mismanagement issue because of woke green policies. The hills light up on fire constantly, and each area gets hit within a person's lifetime, multiple times even. I feel terrible for those who have lost their homes. I am hearing many stories from family and friends and know people who have lost their homes. It's horrible. All I'm saying is the blame being placed on government failure to properly maintain the area is only part of the story. The bigger discussion needs to be on why people build and buy in the most wildfire-prone places of the most wildfire-prone state. So that's an interesting question. That's a great conversation that she brings up here. And I agree, and I kind of agree with that statement. I have to agree with that statement that only talking about the government side of it is only a part of the story. It's only a part of the story. Gavin Newsom and Karen Bass and all those people, that's only part of the story. And you're talking about a significant area, geographical location that's known to wildfires. That's very, very familiar with active wildfires on the regular. And again, it goes back to that conversation. At what point do you look at this area, regardless of climate change, regardless of any of that, at what point do you look at this area and have this moment, have this philosophical moment to say, we can't live here. Like, if you want to raise a community in a place that's going to have rapid wildfires, and you have a government that completely shits the bed to not even provide water to a dry area, then what significance do you have to maintain a society there? What significance do you have to maintain a society in a place that's going to burn up into a crisp? That's the ultimate conversation. That's the ultimate conversation. It's like people that buy in Florida, and they know that they're in passive hurricanes. At what point do you look at your property in Florida? Maybe it's a beachfront property, maybe it's more inland. When do you look at that after the mass amounts of hurricanes and say, this can't work out? That we can't sustain a society if there's going to be occurring natural disasters and we're going to have to rebuild constantly, and knowing that our governments are just completely going to shit the bed. They have no competence into saving people. And that's both Democrat and Republican, by the way. That's not just one side. I'm talking about the whole governmental system. I'm talking about the whole elite pseudo-politic democracy oligarchy that we live in right now. They are not going to save your ass. And if California, Southern California, wants to remain a population in that area, this is probably the hard conversation. This is the black pill moment where people are going to have to discuss this. Because regardless of what you feel about climate change, what you feel about the policies, again, that's its own conversation. I think the reason why we're in this debacle is because in order to prevent more and more destruction by climate change and natural disasters, we have to come together to realize we can't legislate over nature. You can't legislate over nature. Nature is so unpredictable. You don't know what's going to happen. And in cases like California, where you already know the climate of the state, and how it's reverting back to kind of its older years before it became a population. This is the ultimate conversation. This is the ultimate conversation. It's like why there's no homes in the remote deserts of Nevada. It's like why are there no homes in the northern part of Nunavut in Canada? And it's because humanity can't sustain itself in those kind of environments. That's why they chose the areas that we're in right now. That's why a lot of the cities were developed in places near water, because water is essential. So, if California is going to remain itself in a dry area that's prone to all these natural disasters, what is going to keep people alive and around to maintain its habitants, to maintain some sort of sovereignty for people to live in? How are they going to maintain a community and a society that they know that there's going to be constant battles with nature? And considering that Gavin Newsom, state legislators, and this goes to a lot of different states, trying to put these policies intact to battle out with nature, it's just not going to work out. It's not going to work out. So, this is kind of the black pill moment for people to realize. I know it sounds depressing, but this is the other side of the conversation that a lot of people don't want to talk about, don't want to include in this context. I know it's easy just to point the finger and blame Gavin Newsom, and obviously we need to hold them accountable. That's not what I'm not dismissing that, but I'm saying that there's a lot more to be said about these disasters, about California as a whole, about the general population of California. And Kim Iverson makes a good point in you're the one that chose to live here. You know about the active wildfires. You know this happens periodically. And you have government officials that don't give a damn about you. The insurance company is jumping ship. They're not willing to cover a lot of these homes. So what salvage do you have left to maintain society in California, in the southern parts, because of all this?